Well, our next speaker is the Reverend Colonel, is that the right sequence, Timothy Mallard, who is a senior officer in the Chaplain Corps, now working closely with the Chief of Army Chaplains at the Pentagon, but is himself, just as importantly, a contributor to Providence magazine, and equally as importantly, a scholar of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was already mentioned inevitably several times during the course of this conference, because he is almost always on the minds of Christians considering these issues of political statecraft. So Tim is going to clarify any confusion you may have about Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and will answer all of your questions. So Tim, we appreciate your being here.
Wow, no small task there. Clarify all your questions and eliminate all confusion. But I really do appreciate Mark's invitation to be here today. Deeply. I'm always excited and humbled to speak about Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who has been the subject of so much of my life's work, my academic work, and I think is worthy of our study, particularly in terms of the aim of this conference, and you all in particular, the specific target audience of this conference, young millennials who are preparing for careers in both the academy and perhaps even the church and public service. So again, I want to thank Mark Tully for the invitation to come speak, and Mark Levecki for also his guidance and friendship over these past few years. As Mark said, I am an active duty Army chaplain. I am stationed at the Pentagon on the staff of the Army Chief of Chaplains, but I must issue a standard disclaimer, and you'll hear DoD people say these kinds of things all the time. My views today don't represent those of the United States government, the Department of Defense, the Department of the Army Chief of Chaplains, pretty much anybody over in the building where I work. They're intended solely for the advancement of the intellectual and academic topic undertaken, which is in fact what Mark asked me to speak on, the tension, I think, between Dietrich Bonhoeffer and his latent pacifism, and that is my term, latent pacifism, and then the way his career played itself out over the course of specifically 12 years within Nazi Germany. As a way to begin, and I would like to reserve the majority of my time for questions and answers, because I found when speaking about Bonhoeffer, people have probably more questions than I can get to, so I want to honor as much time as possible. Let me, however, first begin by eliminating 4 either myths or stereotypes about Bonhoeffer. And these are my assessment of myths or stereotypes about Bonhoeffer. First, Dietrich Bonhoeffer was not an American evangelical, and neither was he an American liberal, Christian. There have been a number of works done which, to my estimation, have attempted to borrow a term from biblical scholarship, eisegete into Bonhoeffer's work and life. Thank you so much. Eisegete into Bonhoeffer's work and life, our particular hopes or desires to see him, how we want to see him, and I think that has produced unfortunately some scholarship, particularly in secondary literature, the last few years within America, for which we have justly come into some criticism. And I'll be happy to talk about some of those works here in a minute in the Q&A if you want. Secondly, let me say also another myth about Bonhoeffer was that he was not necessarily, and indeed directly, a savior of the Jews. All right? There's a reason why he has not been named a righteous Gentile, to borrow the term from David Gushie's book, but a hero of the Holocaust, a Gentile who was a hero of the Holocaust. He has not been named that by Yad Vashem in Israel. And that's because, except for a specific instance in terms of Plan 7 or Operation 7, it's variously known, to directly affect the extrication of some Jews from Germany. Bonhoeffer was not directly involved in that, only secondarily. Thirdly, and perhaps in a little bit of a distinction with Emily, Bonhoeffer was not directly involved with particularly the 20 July 1944 plot to assassinate Hitler. He was secondarily linked to that by his association with the conspiracy in the Abwehr Directorate. Now, that plot did come out of the Abwehr Directorate. Abwehr is the German word for military intelligence. So, but Bonhoeffer was only secondarily linked to that. His work was somewhat different. And then the fourth myth or stereotype that I would posit for all of us is that for you and for me, we can deeply learn and completely learn about the life and witness of Dietrich Bonhoeffer only by reading secondary sources. So this kind of goes back to my first criticism of some of the works in America that have come out the last few years. I think secondary sources can only point us, frankly, to the primary sources. And I would encourage each of you to, if you're serious about doing rigorous Bonhoeffer scholarship, consult the Dietrich Bonhoeffer works, the English translation, which has now been fully published by Fortress Press, all 17 volumes. Every letter, paper, extant article, book that Bonhoeffer wrote, so the English work is the translation of the original German work. But all 17 volumes are out by Fortress Press, and so you can read for yourself what Bonhoeffer thought, wrote, did, things of this nature, as well as some of the commentary by really considered Bonhoeffer scholars who helped edit those works over many years. So, that said, let me begin by asking a central question, those kinds of opening comments aside. Let me ask a question which I think gets at the heart of what Mark wanted me to address in the life and witness of Dietrich Bonhoeffer and pacifism, but then how his life played out in the conspiracy. And the question I frame is this: how does a Christian navigate the tension between one's theological beliefs and the ethical demands of one's society, particularly those that directly affect whether individuals live or die? That is my attempt to capture the tension that Bonhoeffer felt, and I think, frankly, the more I serve in the public square today, as in my ministry as an Army chaplain, but going around the nation, the tension that I hear voiced so often, particularly by young people. How does a Christian navigate the tension between one's theological beliefs and the ethical demands of one's society, particularly those that directly affect whether individuals live or die? Bonhoeffer was placed in a historical context where he could not avoid having to deal with that question. So it's been famously said about Bonhoeffer, comparison to Karl Barth. Barth started out as a pastor and became a professor. Bonhoeffer started out as a professor and became a pastor, but also a pastor who was deeply involved in the public square, public theology, as I frame it. Bonhoeffer was by no means inarguably brilliant. He graduated from the University of Berlin with his Ph.D. with distinction, which is almost unheard of, at the age of 21 under Reinhold Seeberg, and then later on published his second his Habilitationsschrift, which is the German word for the second technical dissertation that's required to teach. Again, both of those works were rigorous pieces of academic scholarship. Bonhoeffer had prepared for that career, but events from his perspective drove him to take a different path. So my thesis is this, about Bonhoeffer particularly. While Bonhoeffer evidenced, again as I term, a latent pacifism, particularly in some of his early theology and published works, and I'll talk about those in a minute, he had to navigate the tension between that theological belief and the emerging realities of both militarism and nationalism in Nazi Germany, particularly after 1933, but certainly up to 1945. And in doing that, Bonhoeffer chose a course of action, to borrow a military term, an Army term, that has troubled some, and at times wanted to, or at times served to others as a sort of call to action. And that was his decision to engage in one of the resistance plots against the Third Reich. Victoria Barnett, my colleague and fellow Bonhoeffer scholar at the Holocaust Museum downtown here in Washington, D.C., has said that Bonhoeffer's decision to engage in the conspiracy is the single most problematic decision in Bonhoeffer's life that continues to roil Bonhoeffer scholars. Because there seems to be this sort of disconnect between his earlier pacifism and his later activity in the conspiracy. But I want to contend again that there's not. That Bonhoeffer was seeking to negotiate that tension between that pacifism and again the trends of militarism and nationalism as he saw them in Germany. Now, what about Bonhoeffer's pacifism? Let me give two primary source documents which I would encourage you to read if you haven't. The first is Bonhoeffer's address to the World Youth Congress at Fano, Denmark in 1934. That's often held up as sort of the sine qua non of Bonhoeffer's pacifistic ideology. And it's true that was an early public work by Bonhoeffer to a very broad range of particularly young people, but also Christians from around the world. However, it also has to be seen in the context of the fact that by 1934, in August of 1934, when he issued that address, the Nazis had already taken over the federal government, and the Machtergreifung, which is the German compound word for power grab, that's what they call it, on January 30th, 1933, and had even sent representatives to this same Congress. And so Bonhoeffer was very clearly trying to demarcate what he saw as standard Christian pacifism against the emerging political context of Germany. The second document that I would encourage you to read, obviously, is Bonhoeffer's book, Discipleship, right? So if you have a copy, The Cost of Discipleship, I would encourage you again to go to the Fortress Press edition. The original title is Nachfolge in German, which is just discipleship. But that book, in part, is Bonhoeffer's exploration of the demands of the Sermon on the Mount. And so deeply laced throughout that book is Bonhoeffer's attempting to come to grips with what he was seeing as a prescriptive call by Jesus to the kingdom to live out every aspect of ethical life in the new Christian church. And that book, it has to be sort of said as a parenthetical, was first published in 1937 in Germany and was immediately a publishing success, and it was republished several times. So even as early as 1937, while Bonhoeffer had been doing some academic work prior to that, particularly at Berlin, when he published Discipleship, his earlier works had been published as academic works, but when he published Discipleship, he began to get a much wider reading around Germany. And that book, even later into the 30s, went through several reprintings. So we'll come back to that in a moment. So again, Bonhoeffer's World Youth Congress address at Fano in Denmark in 1934, but then also Discipleship, I think capture Bonhoeffer's really deep exploration of his attempt to conduct a biblical exploration of a considered pacifism. It's also true that he was interested in the work of Mahatma Gandhi, and wanted to go to India at one point to study nonviolent social means. He was unable to do that after, as events played themselves out, but he was deeply interested in that early. However, I mentioned that the tension that was emerging within the political context was a very, very pervasive militarism and nationalism within the Third Reich. And so you have to see Bonhoeffer's theological beliefs played out in navigating those other two tensions. That militarism goes back really to the founding of Germany as a nation, with particularly the end of the Franco-Prussian War in 1870-71, and the professional military class that came out of Prussia, and that in the Franco-Prussian War, and then also in World War I, that military caste had really embodied the militarism that had gripped Germany to a large degree. And it was that when Hitler and the Nazis came to power, because of the Versailles Treaty in 1919 and the restrictions on forming a new military, both Hitler and the Nazis had very consciously drawn on that military caste from the Prussian elite, the sort of Junker caste, to reconstitute the German officer corps in the Wehrmacht. And so that very professional military caste had a long provenance, if you will, within even a new German state, only going back several decades. And then I also mentioned, however, the nationalism as a tension. And Emily mentioned very appropriately how the Nazis began to enact their nationalistic ideology in law, not only immediately after the power grab in 1933, but particularly then through the institution of public laws, culminating really with the 1935 Aryan paragraphs in Nuremberg. These became deeply problematic for German Christian, or excuse me, the Landeskirche, so the confessing church, which was emerging in the German, the Pastors' Emergency League, in which Bonhoeffer took a leading role. And one of the key criticisms that the Pastors' Emergency League, Bonhoeffer, Barth, and others had of particularly these laws was that the state had abrogated unto itself a power that should have been inherent only within the church, and that was the desire to want to separate Jews and Jewish Christians from the full sacraments of the church. So those laws, the implication was that if there were Jews who might have been Jews by, let's say, ancestry or heritage or bloodline, because the Nazi ideology of Blut und Volk, right, so blood and people, had begun to be placed into law. They wanted to extend that even to whether a person who was a Jew by heritage but had been baptized as a Christian could then participate in the life of the church, to include the receipt of the sacraments. And Bonhoeffer and other confessing church leaders, particularly in the Pastors' Emergency League, said that simply was a line that had been crossed. The state had no authority to do that. And if you want, we can talk about penultimate and ultimate authority later in the Q&A. But that really was sort of laying that out in 1935. So Bonhoeffer was faced with a situation in which his own perhaps reading of the New Testament and the Sermon on the Mount and his considered biblical development of a biblically based pacifism was now placed in direct conflict with the tensions of militarism and nationalism which he found within his own people. Now, it's important to say that when I use the term latent pacifism, I say that in the sense that Bonhoeffer, again, had developed a very biblically sound orientation toward pacifism. But as was pointed out yesterday by Eric Patterson, the difference between force and violence, I think Bonhoeffer also understood this. So even as considered a biographer as Eberhard Bethge, who has still written the standard biography of Bonhoeffer, and was Bonhoeffer's close friend, and also the person with whom he communicated during prison. Bethge said that Bonhoeffer never completely became a pacifist. That is, he appreciated and saw the need for Christians to take seriously the biblical injunction against violence, and that is Bethge's term. but he was not a pacifist in wanting to deny the power of the state, even as he lived in the midst of a tyrannical state and under the leadership of Adolf Hitler, that he viewed as the Antichrist. Gerhard Leibholz has pointed out that Bonhoeffer clearly viewed Hitler as the Antichrist. He was under no illusions about that. But he did not equate that with the necessity of the state at times to provide security and certainly to use force if necessary. However, all that being said, that's kind of the basis then that forms the backdrop to his decision to join in the conspiracy. So what was Bonhoeffer's actual role in that? Well, Joe talked this morning about Reinhold Niebuhr. Bonhoeffer developed a friendship with Reinhold Niebuhr when Bonhoeffer was a Sloan Fellow at Union Theological Seminary in 1930 to 31. He maintained a correspondence with Niebuhr, and he wrote to Niebuhr even after Niebuhr and others had gained Bonhoeffer safe passage to the United States in 1939. Bonhoeffer came back to New York for 6 weeks, but knew that the storms of war were coming. He wrote Niebuhr and several others and said that he needed to go back to Germany because he couldn't stand with the German people after the war if he did not stand with them now, and that's sort of my characterization of what he wrote. So he came back to Germany, but what's interesting to note is we now know by particularly the Anklageschrift, which is the SS prosecutor's report. You can see the text of that in the Burke Library at Union Seminary in New York City. That Bonhoeffer had actually contacted the conspirators and joined with Major Hans von Dohnanyi and others in the Abwehr to at least broach the idea of participating in the conspiracy that he knew was starting. And by the way, there were, again, I mentioned the Prussian sort of military heritage in militarism within the Wehrmacht. There were a number of conspiratorial efforts by many of these very proud, well-trained military leaders who prior to World War II, going all the way back to 1933, frankly, had a great deal of disdain for Adolf Hitler. And were deeply suspicious of the Nazi Party. They were very much oriented toward the preservation of Germany as a nation and as a people. So there were a number of conspiracies that had gone on within the German High Command, and Harold Deutsch, I think, has still written what is probably the best treatise on that. However, the Abwehr conspiracy, and again, Abwehr is military intelligence, the German term for intelligence, military intelligence, was located within that particular directorate. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, General Major Hans Oster, Major Hans von Dohnanyi, who became Bonhoeffer's brother-in-law, were all located within that directorate, and Bonhoeffer joined in the conspiracy to subvert the Third Reich with them. Now, what did they ask Bonhoeffer to do? Well, they knew that Bonhoeffer, because of his prior international travels, not only to Fano but to other places, had contacts with ecumenical church leaders around Europe and the world. And so they were able to secure for him appointment as what the contraction is Wiemann, right? Sabina Dram has written, I think, probably the seminal treatment on that, and it's a long German word. Go figure. Vertrauensmann, but it's a very specific term. Bonhoeffer was not an assassin. He was not a spy. A Wiemann in German has a particular word image, and that is a sort of plenipotentiary, a sort of confidence man. You are given license by the state, so he had a passport to be able to travel outside Nazi Germany. He could meet with people within his particular professional sphere. So in his case, religious leaders from around Europe and the world. And he could represent the interests of the Third Reich to them. And he was then expected to sort of provide observations, insights. What did he see? What did he hear about them? But really what Bonhoeffer did was continue to try and use those contacts to lay the ground for the eventual success or what they hoped to be the success of the conspiracy to overthrow the Third Reich. Bonhoeffer's ultimate act of treason, and it was an act of treason, and this is the way the SS saw it, particularly when it was finally revealed with the discovery of the Zusen files and Canaris's diary. Bonhoeffer went to Sigtuna, Sweden, in May of 1942, and he met with Bishop George Bell of Chichester, England. Say that 10 times. Bishop George Bell of Chichester, England. Bell and Bonhoeffer had formed a friendship going back to the 30s at several ecumenical meetings in England, and Bell was sympathetic to Bonhoeffer's work. He knew his courage and his attempts to work to undermine the state. Bonhoeffer gave Bell a list of the conspirators in Sweden and asked him directly to go back to the British government and provide the British government that list of conspirators and to ask whether they succeeded in taking down Hitler and the Third Reich, would the Allies treat with the Abwehr intelligence conspirators as the legitimate representatives of the German people? Okay. Now, again, at that point, Bonhoeffer has crossed the line to commit an act of treason, and he knew it, and Bell knew it. And this is, in fact, what the Gestapo would eventually know as well about Bonhoeffer. He was contacting, even informally, a representative of a declared hostile government and combatant in the war with Nazi Germany and asking them to treat with them and sue basically for terms of peace. Bell took that list back to Anthony Eden, the Home Secretary, provided it to him, but one of the responses was, do they have a plan in place to establish a government? And obviously they didn't, and so the attempt never went anywhere. Now, Bonhoeffer was arrested in 1943 later, not related to that specific act. He was arrested because his name came up almost secondarily, and because there was a contest between a conflict between the Abwehr and the SS over who would provide Hitler and the high command intelligence, raw intelligence. And so the SS had orchestrated a sort of desire to sweep up people within the Abwehr, and Bonhoeffer was put into prison. He spent almost 18 months in Tegel prison in Berlin. Think about that, right? He's on the outskirts of Berlin, and Jürgen Moltmann has spoken about the psychology of being a prisoner of war and what that did to Bonhoeffer, because the Allies are bombing Berlin almost daily, right? And Bonhoeffer is still writing in prison. Eventually, he's transferred to Flossenburg, and he was hung with the other conspirators on April 6, 1945, when Admiral Canaris's diary was discovered, and really the entire plot was laid out for Hitler. And even though there was no tactical advantage to the assassination of the conspirators, there was an immense strategic implication, and we can talk about that in the Q&A. So what does that mean for you and for me? If we hold up Bonhoeffer's life as a moral exemplar, and I obviously agree that we do. He's one of 10 martyrs of the 20th century who now owns a statue on the front of Westminster Abbey, which was added late in the 20th century, along with Reverend Martin Luther King and others. Let me suggest 3 things for you all, particularly as young millennials who are wanting to prepare for your own callings in life, to borrow a term that was used yesterday. Number 1, I think like Bonhoeffer, I would encourage you and each of us to work rigorously and with intentionality and much prayer on your own moral formation. Bonhoeffer never, acted out of a sense of later in life with his work in the conspiracy. His actions were never ill-considered. He was deeply aware of what he was doing, but he had grounded that in a prior deep process of moral formation that he had undergone, really beginning with his own university and doctoral work. Those became incredibly formative for him. And so even though he started out preparing for a career in academic theology, he felt compelled by the militarism and the nationalism of his day to work into a new career in public theology. But he was always deeply and well grounded in his own moral formation process, and I would encourage that as a model for each and every one of us. Secondly, if and I've heard this question, I think, in several forms by some of the young people here, if you could recommend areas in which I could get involved and live out my own sense of calling today, what would it be? I would recommend two things. To pray seriously about joining the career of the profession of service in the church, as Bonhoeffer did. He was ordained. He was not only an academic theologian, he was ordained, and served actually as a vicar in Barcelona for a German congregation early on, and then pastor of a congregation in London, German-speaking congregations in London. But I would pray about that because, frankly, I would contend that the profession of the ministry in the United States is under grave threat from a corrosive lack of attention on the part of this generation. And the number, believe me, working in the Army chaplaincy and having to try and recruit new ordained religious leaders for service within our ranks is becoming deeply challenging. So I would pray about that, but I would also in the vein of public theology, advocate prayerful consideration of a vocation in either the diplomatic, the informational, the military, the economic, the financial, the intelligence, or the law enforcement domains of American public life. I've defined public theology in my dissertation along those lines, that is in fact a noble vocation that helps support, as was talked about yesterday and today, the Augustinian notion of the common good. So a prayerful consideration about either professional service of, and I thought David Shedd's admonition yesterday was well taken, not just for 5 years or 10 years, but a career in service to the church or to the nation in one of those venues. And then finally, I would think that the most important thing would be to, like Bonhoeffer, no matter where each and every one of us plays out our careers in service to our nation, to remain well grounded in that original process of moral formation. To borrow an analogy from the United States Army, we define a member of the profession of arms as a person of character, competence, and commitment, right? Those three things. And we have lots of people of competence, we have lots of people of commitment. The question, I think, is always character, and no matter whether it's in the Army or outside the Army. Bonhoeffer never left the process of moral formation with which he began. And it's that led him to write in his unfinished ethics, he was working on that when he was in prison in Tegel, these words that I close with. Only the person who combines simplicity with wisdom can endure. But what is simplicity? What is wisdom? How do the two become one? A person is simple who in the confusion, the distortion, and the inversion of all concepts keeps in sight only the single truth of God. The single-minded person, and he's playing off against James, double-minded. The single-minded person does not also cast glances at the world while standing next to God, and therefore is able, free, and unconstrained to see the reality of the world. Thus, simplicity becomes wisdom. Only that person is wise who sees in reality God. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Hi, my name is Ashley. I'm a master's student at American University studying U.S. foreign policy and national security.
Okay.
And I was just curious, what modern injustices, whether that be in society or even in the church, do you think that Bonhoeffer would be fighting against if he were alive today?
Wow, so somebody asked earlier about channeling Niebuhr, and I'm not sure I'm qualified to channel Bonhoeffer. I will say the more I study Bonhoeffer, the more I read Bonhoeffer, the more humbled I am at the depth and complexity of his work and the challenges that he faced. But to try and answer your question, I think that Bonhoeffer, again, his concerns about militarism and nationalism were prevalent within his day. And I think that those are always prevalent within each and every nation state. I don't, again, speak for the United States government in that regard. But each and every nation state, I think, faces those kinds of tensions, and they play themselves out in different ways. I think Bonhoeffer, when he was hanged at Flossenburg, it was only 3 months short of the introduction of atomic weapons into war and the dawn of the nuclear age and the revolution in military affairs that inaugurated. I think Bonhoeffer would be quite concerned and wanting to engage on that level. I think he would be engaged about any number of humanitarian crises, particularly an interest in refugees. I think, however, Bonhoeffer would take deeply to task the predilection of, I'll say particularly American Christianity, I can't speak for other nations, to want to move away from a biblically grounded and orthodox Christianity. When he was a student at Union, he very, now this may reflect some sort of slight bias as a German, and he had been out of Germany before, but not to America in 1930-31. But he used the term about American enthusiasts, and yet he was deeply moved by. So he had some condemnation for the social gospel, like was mentioned this morning about Niebuhr, but he was also deeply moved by the experience of former slaves and the children of slaves at Abyssinian Baptist Church in Harlem in New York City. And yet he was concerned that American Christians were too quick to jettison dogmatic theology and de-link it from any kind of praxis in either the church or society. I think he would be even more concerned about that de-linkage today. So, yes, please. And I appreciate you using the microphone. My hearing's not very good, so.
Good morning. My name is Sarah Williamson, and I'm the Executive Director of Protect the People. We work with the military on protecting civilians in conflict.
Okay.
And I'm just curious about your current role with the Army and serving as a chaplain, and how do you apply some of these more moral lessons to what you do in your daily life with soldiers?
That's a wonderful question. I'm happy to expound on it, because to me it goes right along with Bonhoeffer's given appropriation of theological ethics. And so I view my own career as an attempt to live out theological ethics within the military, the vocation of military professional officership. One of the things that I'm working within the Department of the Army on at the Pentagon and across with our partners in other services is to invigorate the discussion, the reflection upon, and the duty to enact ethics in the profession of arms. And that, Samuel Huntington, famously in his work, The Soldier in the State, said that the vocation of the officer, and he was speaking about the military officer, is the management of violence on behalf of the Republic. And I think that is deeply true, but with the latent power that the United States military possesses, and frankly other coalition allies, I have a deeply vested and personal interest in ensuring the moral formation of leaders who can exercise that power on behalf of the church that I represent. I'm Evangelical Presbyterian minister, and the people of God. So that's one of the ways that we're working right now specifically, but also we have done work cross-culturally in terms of ministry with people groups, at-risk people groups in other areas downrange. I've been involved in some of those, particularly in Iraq previously, although I can't say much more about that. I will say this regarding ethics. I'm pleased to be able to announce today that we are going to be holding a major conference on the centennial of World War I next summer at the National Defense University here in Washington, D.C., and our own Mark Levecki is going to be one of our plenary speakers on that. And that at that conference, we're bringing together representatives from coalition allies, including the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, but also the other services. And we're looking at what is a century of war, 1918 to 2018. What are the lessons learned from that conflict that can inform the profession of arms today? And so we're going to take a look at that from both a joint and a coalition or allied perspective. Again, with the attempt to try and inform the profession of arms about how the United States or how allies will exercise power in the future. So those kinds of initiatives I think are very exciting and a lot of fun to work on. So, other questions? I saw a hand up somewhere. Or yes, sir.
Jim Mahoney, I'm an MDiv student at Asbury Theological Seminary. I was actually curious about what role you think that systematic theology or dogmatic theology plays in the formation of the military officer, not the chaplain, but the officer that is in a spiritual advisor role to a chaplain, or vice versa, rather.
An officer's spiritual advisor role to me.
Right, I mean the opposite of that.
Oh, okay. Well, I think you've asked a really poignant question, given that in the American context, it's been quite well developed, the changing trends in religious affiliation, and to use a term a colleague of mine, Tom Bedoin, once used, the biblical illiteracy of an emerging generation of people who putatively call themselves to be Christians. When, particularly for a values-based organization like a military, the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, and the Marine Corps are all values-based institutions. So how do we take people who are now coming out of a societal trend of a lack of moral formation and then turn them into professionals in the military ranks who have a deeply well-formed moral ideal and then can live that out ethically in behavior? That is a huge challenge, that generational challenge for the military as a profession of arms. In the past, we could look at exemplars like George Marshall. Marshall was a devout Episcopalian, but went home and dug in his garden every day in World War II because he knew the value of recreation, and he linked that to his own theological life and God's presence in his life. Perhaps we're moving out of being able to assume that all our leaders will be able to have or share that kind of formation. And I'm not necessarily saying that should be only from a Christian ideal, because we live in a pluralistic military in which we have people of many different religious confessions or no religious confessions. But the problem still stands for us as a military. How do we form leaders morally to live and work in that context out of the social context from which we draw members of the profession of arms? That is a challenge for the military today. One of the things that I can tell you that I think that we need that help on the part of churches and religious organizations across America is to actively appreciate and support the ministry of their chaplains that represent them within the force. I work in a way on behalf of my faith tradition inside the building, inside the profession of arms, as it were. I would encourage all faith traditions, Jewish, Protestant, Roman Catholic, Muslim, Orthodox, Islamic, to support their chaplains who, representing the free exercise of religious belief, which we held up as critical to our functioning as a body politic yesterday, to support their ministry on their behalf within the profession of arms. That has to be done with intentionality on the part of those denominations. I know many of them are, but I would encourage all faith traditions to do that. So, great question. Are we at the end, Mark, or we have one more time for one more? Or
Our lunches are a few
Oh.
minutes are being served, so just keep talking.
Okay.
until lunch is on.
great. Thanks. Yes, ma'am.
My name is Rhonda, and I just want to thank you for your service on both fronts. Thank you. I've heard and I've met chaplains myself. I'm a reservist.
Okay.
Signed the Pentagon.
Right.
But I've met chaplains outside of my military service,
Uh-huh.
down in Hampton Roads area, and other chaplains who have, one was in a newspaper recently, a couple years ago, and some books mentioned about the challenges of being a chaplain in the military now and some persecution from within the military. I haven't spoken to this person in 2 years. I haven't really read up on, I haven't been focused on that much in the last couple of years, but is that still an ongoing problem, or is that a tension per se?
Well, personally, let me say that I personally have never experienced an episode in my own career where I was asked to compromise my religious beliefs or the confessional positions of the denomination that I represent on active duty. And my father was an Army chaplain, so I've been around this ministry since 1969 in a way. And to my knowledge, before he died, neither was he. However, I think what is, and officially as policy, within the Department of Defense and certainly within the Department of the Army, chaplains are charged to preach, teach, and counsel in accordance with their faith traditions and can't be adjured to do otherwise, at least not legally. Now, that said, you used the word tension, and I like that word tension, as you heard from my own talk. I think one of the tensions, the realities of the profession of arms today within America is that we have more and more, not only millennials joining the initial ranks, but now many of those are being promoted into leadership positions, right? So they may have chosen a career of service as an officer or a non-commissioned officer, and they're being promoted into leadership positions in battalions and maybe even in brigades. And if they come from a worldview which says, you know, there is no God, or I don't care about religion, that under the First Amendment they have the right to believe that. But then I think there's the added tension if they're in a leadership position. Well, what do I do with my chaplain? How do I employ my chaplain in service to my soldiers and to their families? That's a tension that I think many chaplains have expressed concern about how to navigate. I would say that it's also an added layer to that tension is that because so much of the world does not share the sort of base secularism that's pervasive now in American society, and anywhere that we would go in the world to conduct military operations, religion is usually going to be a vital construct to the functioning of cultures, right? Will those commanders use their chaplains and the resources of all of their command to advise them about how religion is shaping tactical operations or even operational or strategic considerations in that area? I think that's also a challenge for emerging and developing military leaders. Now, that said, regarding that last point, having done some teaching at the Army War College, and I was also a student there, and being involved in professional military education at the senior service college level, I find a deep interest on the part of most students in the senior service colleges, the war colleges, to study religion and religious impacts and influences, in particular relative to operations. Even if they may not personally have a confessional position or life, they're very, very interested in that, and particularly how that informs both conflict and then post-conflict establishment of peace. So, thanks. That's a great question. I appreciate that. Yes, sir. And just tell me when the sandwiches get here, and I know how to cut. We call it cut and sling load in the Army. Okay, this is the last question. Yes, sir.
My name is Emmanuel Mtangana, and I have a question. Your rank is a colonel, right?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear.
Your rank is a colonel.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Yes.
So in military, like exploits. And on the other side, if you're not a chaplain, maybe you're given a rank given your responsibilities or military exploits. So for the chaplain, how do you get from a private to a colonel? What is the dynamics behind that?
That's a great question. The chaplains, at least in the United States Army, and I know the other services as well, come up for periodic review for promotion. And so I started out as a second lieutenant chaplain candidate, then became a first lieutenant and then a captain, and then was promoted later to major, then lieutenant colonel, and then colonel. And it was a board action. So there's a board that met here in Washington, D.C. They reviewed my file. They compared me to other chaplains. They looked at the efficiency reports that I got from commanders, what I had done, my experience level, and then they're able to choose, okay, these are the most qualified, the best qualified people, and I happen to be on each of those promotion lists. So I never met anybody who selected me for those promotions. And personally, I will say, I view my rank now as a colonel as a means for greater and greater service, right? So I don't want to view myself in terms of being a colonel, even though I am, as sort of aggregating power or authority or status unto me. I want to use that in a way rather as a servant leader to increase my sense of service to the force that I served, or that I serve. But we basically, to answer your question, chaplains, like every other branch in the Army, infantry, aviation, whatever, undergo promotion board reviews like every other officer, and some are selected and some are not. And we all reach a point of having to complete our service. I'm coming close to mine in a few years here, or a year. Then we have to pray about where God will have us serve next. So, thanks. Thank you, Mark.